Hi, I'm Kat Rosenfield.
And I'm Phoebe Maltz Bovy, and together we are Feminine Chaos.
Reunited.
And reunited. So thank you so much, Kat, for holding down the chaotic and feminine court while I was on maternity leave. I am still technically on maternity leave, but I am saying hello to Blogging Heads listeners and viewers alike for another installment. And this one is going to be about, well, sort of, I was trying to think what's the theme uniting our topics for this installment. And I think it's kind of self-cancellation seems to be the theme holding together at least two of our thousands, no, just like three topics. Basically, what is self-cancellation? Well, so cancel culture is what when people talk about sort of the thing online, especially on Twitter, maybe Tumblr when that was more of a thing, where somebody is canceled, meaning that they've said something problematic and it is no longer acceptable to like that artist or whatever. Self-canceling is when somebody realizes they've been problematic and rather than getting defensive or just sort of ignoring their critics or just even listening to their critics, they say, yes, you know what, I have been terrible. And what do they do next? It depends in which context. So we're going to talk about two contexts of self-cancellation, what that's about. The first to do with young adult literature, which Kat will tell us more about. And also then the second one will be from a maybe less expected sphere, namely knitting.
Knitting, that hotbed of drama and intrigue.
Kat, have you knit? Do you ever knit?
I do not knit.
Okay, so neither do I. I do not knit. So we are going to parachute into the knitting topic. But first, Kat, I want to ask you about your great article in Vulture, the latest YA Twitter pylon forces a rising star to self-cancel. So I'm here also as the stand-in for any viewers who don't know much about YA. I don't. So I guess a lot of this went a bit over my head. So just recount for us what happened. What was all of this?
Okay. Yeah. I'll do my best to keep this short. So in YA, which is young adult fiction, the Twitter community is an interesting place, made up not really of young adults, definitely not teenagers, but it's more bloggers and people who write young adult fiction or want to write young adult fiction, needless to say, probably very female dominated. So a bunch of adult women, basically. And the dynamics in the community are really interesting. This is just kind of like a background before we dive into the specifics of this incident. It's not uncommon in this community, which is very passionate about social justice, very internet savvy, very used to using social media, for activist purposes, to kind of spearhead or get involved in controversies surrounding books that have been deemed problematic for one reason or another. And sometimes it takes the form of like minor grumbling. Sometimes it can escalate into like a full-blown campaign to really just torpedo a book, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so much. And I wrote about this for Vulture about 18 months ago, more of like a case study in a book that was subject to like months and months of dragging a debut author in the fantasy realm. So there are certain things in common with this new one that I'm going to talk about in a second.
I'm going to just interrupt to ask with that article, the article that you had written before. I don't remember whether do you remember, or I'm sure you remember, sorry, I don't remember whether that author self-canceled.
No, she didn't.
Okay.
So this is like when your book is targeted by young adult Twitter, you have a couple of options, and one of them is to ride it out for the several months it will take for your book to release. This is always happening pre-publication. So that author did not, she basically just didn't respond, didn't engage, and continued doing her best to promote her book, even as its Goodreads ratings tanked and people vowed not to read it, and suggested that anybody who wanted to read it was a racist and a bad person, and so on. So that book came out and actually did pretty well, which makes it surprising that this go round there was this fantasy novel called Blood Air by an author named Amelia Zhao, and very soon after the ARC was released, the ARC is the Advanced Readers Copy, for those not in the know. It's sent to bloggers and reviewers and such to try to get early buzz for the book. So there started being these grumblings, kind of in this scattered way. First, somebody accused Amelia Zhao of screenshotting negative reviews with the intention of going after bloggers.
That was the part where I was a bit lost from knowing a bit about the book publishing world, but not that part of it.
Yeah, we'll get back to that.
Yes,
so
okay.
Just to kind of unpack the whole thing. So this was the first sign that her book was being scrutinized. And then somebody, for a while it was subtweeting, then somebody finally named her, said that she was being shady, she was doing this, they were going to call her out by name. And something about that the naming of this person that everybody was kind of grumbling about in subtweets seemed to kind of crack something open in the community, and all of a sudden there were all of these accusations flying around, including that she had committed cultural insensitivity by misusing the Russian naming conventions in this Russian-inspired fantasy novel, and that she had plagiarized. But the accusation that ended up sticking, as is often the case, was that the book is racist, specifically anti-Black, having to do with a scene. It seemed mainly having to do with a scene in which a character who some people thought was coded as Black dies at a slave auction and is sung to by the white protagonist, or I should say some people saw her coded as white, and some people felt that this was stereotypical, problematic, or anti-Black to use the.
Do you mind if I'm going to just have to jump in and ask about the coded as, because I promise I'm familiar with fiction, but I just am confused about what it means for a character to be coded as a race as versus to be referred to as being, you know what I mean? Is it a name or something? What does it mean in this context? Coded.
Yeah, it can be a few different things. Obviously, this character, it's not like this character's name was, I don't know, Bocephus or Shaniqua or something something.
So there wasn't a reason there wasn't, what you're saying is there wasn't a reason to act. So
the thing is, you have there's explicit, there's, this was a Black person, and then there's coded, this person had X color skin or X shaped eyes.
Right. Right.
So in this case, this female character's skin was referred to as, I think, tawny or bronze, or maybe both. And so this is where I kind of run into problems. I haven't read the book. It was impossible to get a hold of in its ARC form, especially once this controversy became such a thing. But Slate did get a hold of a copy, and their reviewer, who, for what it's worth, is a woman of color, went through it and said, basically said, do these allegations have merit? No, I don't think they do. I think that the people who were reading this and saying that this character was coded as Black, are at least not objectively correct.
That's interesting, and that's going to tie into our knitting topic too, where the people in a knitting thread that we will be talking about later, who were saying actually there's no racism here, were at least identifying as women of color, and the people saying there was racism seemed to be by and large white. I don't know if that played out similarly here.
So the person leading the charge in this case was a woman of color, who's also a fellow author, also writes fantasy. This is a common thread in a lot of these things, that there does seem to be I mean, it's never explicit, but you can surmise that there may be a little bit of a competition element to it. You know, it's like this person is writing in the same genre. But just to get quickly back to like the
sorry. Of course.
let me just finish this up. So Amelie Winslow was being accused of insensitivity and so on in this book. And things had barely gotten off the ground. Only a couple of people had left 1-star reviews without reading it. Only a couple of people had already vowed not to read the book because it was problematic. And kind of abruptly, she just pulled it from publication. She's like, I'm canceling this. And it's not clear whether she intends to edit it and change the parts that people found offensive and then publish it at a later date, or if she's just going to be giving back her entire advance, which was substantial.
Right, so that hasn't been resolved.
Everything's being very kind of like, it's all close to the vest. Nobody really knows. And I've seen rumors about it on Twitter, but I don't really feel like I can repeat them because, you know, who knows. So she self-canceled. And that was sort of where things ended, except that for, I think, a variety of reasons, people found this disturbing, the whole thing, or galling. And so the media picked up, I mean, obviously, including myself, really kind of picked up this story and started talking about it. A lot of people weighed in, a lot of kind of Twitter pundits weighed in. And outside the YA community, for sure, there was a consensus that this was a bad thing. You know, this was bad for free expression. This is bad for artists, bad for writers, bad for storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking from outside of this, but I do find it fascinating. And I guess what I find, there's a few aspects of this that I want to ask you about. I don't even know where to begin because there's quite a lot going on in all of this. I mean, I guess the first is just how to distinguish between YA and like literary fiction or even classics, where
this at least is an easy question to answer, in terms of what makes YA.
Well, in terms of what makes it YA, in terms of like in literary fiction, maybe less so in recent years, it's been just, maybe the book, it's not that a book might have been inadvertently offensive, but I'm thinking about I keep going back to the same when we're talking about this, but the French author, Welbeck, who, he's just an ass, is like the thing, and he goes with it in the fiction, you know what I mean? And there's no pretense that it's something else. And it just seems like that's so far from possible. And is it all of YA or just some of it, where it seems like the books need to have a social justice sort of mission, as versus that they need to just not be so offensive that they would just be wrong for this day and age. You know what I mean? Everything, there are certain things that would just seem completely off for a particular time, but this seems to go further.
No, I mean, stuff in the latter category, I think just is not being published. You see the digging and the reaching that has to happen. I kept thinking, as I was sort of watching this unfold, of this essay by Frederick de Boer, where he talks about offense archaeologists, people who kind of make it their business to act like the cultural police and to go through books or television or whatever, just kind of looking for a nugget of something.
Right. Well, to dig. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's an important point, because it seems like what I've often noticed with things like this in other genres is that what really gets people going in this sort of outrage cycle isn't the thing that's the most outrageous, but it's the thing where somebody has found, like what you're saying, a nugget, where somebody has found something that maybe wouldn't have been obviously offensive and maybe isn't actually offensive, but then that can allow for the whole cycle of, well, if you don't see why this is offensive, then clearly, you know what I mean? It can, whereas things that are sort of more abundantly offensive kind of weirdly can get a pass. And also similarly, I think my sense of this, I have not tallied any of this, is that what paradoxically ends up happening is writers who are progressive, writers who are, for example, women of color, will end up sort of getting more heat.
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe it's that more is expected or something like that.
Yeah.
But the jealousy aspect also fascinates me. So we'll have to discuss that as well.
Yeah, I mean, the dynamics within the community lend themselves to this. Like, there's this kind of, especially in YA, there's this expectation that you're going to be online. There's this expectation that you're going to be engaged. And the influencers in the community are these really avid social justice diversity activists. And, I say this every time I talk about this, but it's worth noting, diversity in publishing is a legitimate issue. It's, very white dominated. It's very dominated by white women, particularly. And so people who are seeking to diversify the ranks, both in-house and in terms of who is getting published, they have a legitimate criticism of the industry. And
I agree about that. Yeah.
The problem is that when the quest to improve diversity takes the form of trying to suppress material that people find offensive, not only is it, arguably, are we really supporting diversity, but in many cases it ends up cutting off legitimate efforts to improve diversity at the knees. And Blood Air is a great example of that. Amelia Wenzhou was, by any reasonable standard, an absolute Cinderella story for diversity in publishing. 25-year-old Chinese immigrant, no publishing connections. She met her agent in a Twitter pitching contest for marginalized creators and got one of the biggest book deals of the year, and it didn't matter. This is the kind of author who all of these influencers say that they really want to see more of and who they say they want to support. But when it came time for her book to come out, not only did they not support her, but they went after her the way that they do with anybody else.
Yeah. I mean, I think that maybe what part of this is something I wrote about a few years ago for the New Republic in terms of the VITA survey. That's a survey of how many, at that point, I think it may have just been women, although I think they've branched to more categories, but it was something like how many women are published and reviewed in various sort of mainstream and literary publications. Mm-hmm. But then there was also, they'd also looked at something to do with, I guess, how many women were represented or strong female characters or something. And I was arguing that what should matter is who's reviewed and who's published, the actual sort of labor aspects of this, and that it shouldn't be about finding diversity among characters, fictional characters. Because I think having diversity among the people who are creating work and gatekeepers will, like we were talking about before, will sort of lend itself to that happening. But to sort of address this at the level of the fiction itself seems like a dangerous road to go down, because policing content it's just a different thing. And I mean, one of the interesting things about Amelia Wenzhou is, although she's Chinese herself, she didn't write an own voices story, is what they call it, when it's from the perspective of a Chinese protagonist. And she was explicit about this. She's saying, I want diverse stories to be the norm, and I don't want diverse authors to be shoeboxed into writing only characters who look like them, only characters who share their backgrounds, because ultimately that hurts us. And I think that that's a really good point. It's what's also interesting about this kind of quest to to target books based on their content is that it's I'm trying to think how to say this. These people claim to support diversity, but what they end up really enforcing is ideological conformity in terms of how a story is supposed to be told. And this is kind of the fundamental thing that they care about the most, and that it didn't, prevent them from going after the debut novel of a young woman of color. That at the end of the day, she didn't tell her story the way they would have preferred, and so they were going to leverage their influence within the community to hurt the book or force it. Yeah. I mean, I don't know. It's just, I think that what seems like it can happen is that somehow there's things diverge, where there's the path that's kind of the art that becomes kind of not exactly propaganda, but almost more educational materials, and not just aimed at young people, but aimed at people of all ages, and then there's the other art that isn't, and then that gets a pass, and that gets ultimately treated like real art in a way, which ends up cutting off the possibility. I think it ends up, sort of paradoxically hurting the very people it's supposed to help, and then only somebody like Jonathan Franzen gets to count as like a writer, which is not really ideal. No. But I have a couple more questions about this because I'm really fascinated by this. So one is just this question of sort of like the role of US-centric readings of things in all of this, because so this is not simply about an author of Chinese ancestry. She came to the US from China at 18, looks like, from what I read. And it seemed like some of what was happening was she was being kind of told, well, like you've missed the US context and how everything seems in the US context, therefore there's a problem. And obviously this is being published in the US, so that would be a perfectly reasonable thing for an editor for, to say like this, but I think it did make me think of a couple other things that have come up recently where, and not so recently, where there's this type of thing, this thing that can happen online where people are interacting all over the world, but it gets kind of, everything gets a US context, even things that don't have to. So the most recent of these that I'm thinking of was there was an op-ed in the New York Times about so-called TERFs, so totally different topic. But we're not getting into that topic. It's just that there was this op-ed that was saying that the op-ed was saying, why is it that British feminists are trans exclusionary, whereas North American ones are less trans exclusionary? And the author of the op-ed said something about how, British feminists are less attuned to indigenous populations. And somebody was pointing out on Twitter that indigenous has a meaning in the UK, but I guess it's more kind of like nativist and very much the opposite of what it means in a US or Canadian context. And that this was kind of trying to fit things into a frame where it didn't quite make sense. And then in that thread, there were people saying that they get annoyed when, and understandably so, when the expression African American apparently gets used to refer to Black people in the UK and in other places that are not, in America. And it just seems like there is something, and so I was thinking about that. I was also thinking about a story from a while ago, in controversy terms, the kimono exhibit at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts.
Oh my gosh, yes.
So that would be that same dynamic where there was an exhibit where there were some activists, at least some of whom were Asian American, who found it offensive that I guess part of the exhibit was that, I know you know about this probably more than I do, that you could try on a kimono or something. You could try on
a kimono. What's really interesting about this is that kimono was made specifically for that exhibit and specifically for that purpose, so that people could try it on. And the exhibit had traveled to Boston from Japan, and the kimono came with it. So, you had people in the US doing the exact same thing that the Japanese had been doing when the exhibit was over there.
And people from Japan were quoted, like people in Japan were quoted in what I read about it, saying that they did not find this offensive. And it almost seemed like there was something sort of in a twisted way offensive about assuming it would be offensive, where it's like,
yeah, I don't know. I was just gonna say, what I remember especially about that incident was how there were pictures of these, I guess teenage or very young adult activists. And there was one where there was an elderly couple trying on the kimono, and this girl had her finger in their face, was clearly scolding them. And I think a lot of Japanese nationals, people who live there, were, saw this picture and were actually kind of horrified by it.
Yeah.
There was a sense that the activists, we're not just incorrect, but in the wrong, you know, like on a moral level, to be trying to police culture in this way.
Well, I think there's also, I mean, that's not an uplifting story. There's also just something about this notion of what it is that, like, this very US-centric notion of exactly what the hierarchy of cultures is, that gets kind of reinforced by the very people sometimes who are trying to push back against things like this, where like the possibility that people are sort of from the US looking up to a culture that's different rather than that it's somehow mocking. You know what I mean? Like, it's almost inconceivable from a certain standpoint that this would be just admiration and genuine and not, you know, and like sort of and nothing to do with mockery, if that makes sense, or cultural appropriation and some sort of stealing and getting the money from, you know what I mean? Like, it just... Yeah.
This is obviously edging more into the cultural appropriation side of things. What I think is interesting about you know, when you're talking about rather a narrative in fiction, that a necessary side effect of improving diversity in terms of your authors and you know who's telling stories is that you're going to get more diverse perspectives, and that includes, you know, somebody maybe writing a story inspired by, for instance, like in Blood Air, the history of indentured servitude in Asia, you know, something that she would have had relatively direct experience with or generational experience with. And the idea that an author isn't allowed to do that, obviously, is, you know, that she needs to kind of cave to this very specific, very hypersensitive American sensibility.
Well, it also just seemed like it was a different, I mean, I obviously have not read this book. I've not even looked for it, but it just seems sort of like, if this is about a different historical situation, does it have to be put through the lens of, like, I feel like there's some way to balance the need to address the audience you're addressing, and also the need to be able to tell stories that are not necessarily to do with the US, and to just sort of,
I mean, you know, the criticisms in this case, it's hard to, I don't know. I feel like I'm going back and forth on this, because we always end up talking about, you know, whether the thing was offensive or not. But there's also an argument that it shouldn't necessarily matter.
Exactly.
I mean, you know, like, if you want to live in a society with a robust commitment to free expression, particularly for artists, you have to allow that material is going to get through that some people, and maybe even a lot of people, find offensive, but that other people don't and want to read, and you know, have to be okay with that.
Absolutely. I mean, I agree with you on this. I think this is what seems sort of frustrating, that the conversation then always becomes, well, like, but is it like sort of digging for, but is it actually furthering the cause of social justice, this book? And it's like, what if it's neither here nor there? You know, I think the bar, there can be a different bar. I think you can say certain things are just so hateful that, you know, it wouldn't be a great idea, you know what I mean, without that being suppressive of free expression, to say if something's just truly like somebody's just written some book that's just like cursing out every single marginalized group, you know, fine, then that's not, you know, but
it would never be published. Like, that wouldn't make it through the editorial process.
Although I will say, I have to give an anecdote here that I saw. This was when I was still living in New York. My high school, but like a few years ago though, there was some kind of used book sale to raise money for, I think, the robotics team of my high school in Lower Manhattan, public high school. And they were selling different books. And one of the books was Mein Kampf. Like, there it was. And I was thinking, like, that's different. That's different.
I may actually be more of a you know, free speech absolutist on this stuff than you are, because I don't really see, I mean,
I was just surprised. I was
not around to profit from the book, so I don't see anything wrong with people reading it, especially if, you know, it offers some kind.
Oh no, I mean, I don't see anything wrong with people reading things like this either. And like, my dissertation was a lot based on sort of French equivalents of that. It just seemed like I wasn't sure they were aware of what they had somehow, because it was like high school students, but maybe.
I was going to say, that is, you know, I mean, obviously, like, you're selling the book to children, there is a different dynamic.
But I mean, I guess I just think it shouldn't have to be like, yeah, it does. I guess this is where the YA angle kind of confuses me a bit, because I just wonder, like, is it that the bar is just different, in a different spot than it is in terms of free expression, because it's meant to be for younger readers?
Well, I mean, there are already standards in place, you know, where things like super explicit sex won't get through an editor in YA. It's where you're starting to kind of say, like, well, does this book push the correct values, that you start to run into trouble, because we are talking literally about, you know, a moral argument, basically. Once people start saying, like, this book promotes the wrong image of such and such a group, or promotes the wrong message. You know, and this is historically, YA has been a real magnet for this kind of criticism. People, you know, who kind of invoke the vulnerable young reader who's so impressionable, you know, who's literally endangered by this stuff. And I don't know, like, I didn't find that a compelling argument when it was coming from the right when I was a teenager, and I don't find it any more compelling now that it's coming from the left.
That makes sense. Yeah,
that's just me, though.
No, I get that. So I think what I want to talk about kind of segues us a little bit into the next topic, but it's still about the first topic, which is, what do you do in cases where artists themselves agree that they should be canceled? So this connects us to our next topic too, where we're going to discuss a knitting blogger and knitting professional, I guess, who maybe offended, maybe didn't, and profusely apologized for this. And it was a similar dynamic, because it was, again, the situation where somebody arguably, well, it's questionable whether they even did anything wrong to begin with, but where they kind of went through the motions, although not with so much money at stake, clearly. And I guess that was what I'd wonder just about the YA story, though, just like, to defend the art is almost to sort of ignore the author's wishes to have the art not exactly destroyed, but, you know, not come to light. Like, what do you do in these cases? Like, I just find that, like, how do you choose the art over the artist? And because I guess, like,
it's just a principle. I mean, it's about it's bigger than any one author or any one book.
I mean, I guess what I mean maybe is more just like, I guess I found some of the coverage of this a little frustrating, where it's kind of like this poor Chinese American woman being piled on. It's like, if she's not actually upset about it in that way, if she just is upset because, well, it's hard to know what's in anybody's heart of hearts, but if she feels like, oops, I didn't mean to write a racist book, and I did write a racist book, if that's how she sees it, it seems wrong to say that she was, you know, like, it's hard to know. I think there's just a lot that's unknowable.
Yeah, I guess I always think about this in terms of, like, going back, you know, several decades, when everyone was very avidly trying to sniff out and suppress communism or communist messages in art. And, you know, I'm sure at the time there were plenty of people who self-censored, not out of any genuine belief that they had done something wrong, but because the costs of, you know, preserving their work as was were too high. And I don't know. I don't want to speculate about, you know, what is in anyone's heart of hearts. The thing that does concern me, though, is that whenever an author caves to this kind of criticism at this stage of the writing process, they are feeding this sense of entitlement and this expectation on the part of people, you know, who are already kind of digging for offense in the first place, that if they make enough noise, if they make just the right accusation, that an artist or an author will change their work to placate them. And that seems to me like a really bad norm to establish.
That's, yeah. I mean, I think this notion of the digging for offense, I do find very compelling, and also in terms of, like, this, what we were talking about before, in terms of the possible jealousy aspect that can come up in, I mean, this has come up in things I've written about as well a while ago, but just, it seems like it's not, like, it's not acceptable to say, to even speculate that ever enters into anything. Obviously, again, like with the caveat, nobody knows what's motivating anybody exactly, but given what publishing a book generally pays, and given how much fame and fortune seem to be going on in this case, it seems very likely that would enter into it. But then it's like, but you just have to kind of, there's certain people, well, not certain people, because it's not about at all like identity groups or even individuals, but like certain roles get the benefit of the doubt and others don't. And like the successful creator does not get the benefit of the doubt, but anybody who's online and even so much as saying that other people might be offended gets the benefit of the doubt.
Right. It's that thing, you know, even if the person themselves is not claiming to be offended, it's like, I'm just pointing out to you that somebody else might be, and I'm speaking on behalf of them.
Oh boy. So I think we are ready for the knitting. I don't know.
Yeah.
You could wrap up if you have more on the
There's
YA
one last thing I want to say about this, and it's almost like a public service announcement, because one of the interesting things that happened after the Blood Heir saga was there was almost a sense in the community. One of my friends who still publishes in YA, who shall remain nameless because it would be bad for her to be associated with me, said that there was this sense of like the dog that caught the mail truck. That, you know, they had been so busy kind of and so invested in performatively calling out this book that at the end of the day, they had crushed the career of a young woman of color. And it was like, oops, you know. And in the aftermath, most people, unfortunately, were not reckoning with that really in like an honest way, but rather we're kind of trying to recast this as just an example of the critical system working. It was like, oh, you know, when ARC was sent out, people said it was offensive, and so she withdrew it to change it, and that's how it's supposed to work. And I just want to kind of like take a moment to say that is not how it's supposed to work. ARCs are not unleashed on the public so that like Joe blogger or Joe author or Joe reviewer can provide editorial feedback. That's not what
right. Jeez, it's not like the public and sensitivity reader. It's weird. It wouldn't be at that stage. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, you know, it's like when somebody is soliciting sends you an ARC to solicit a book review, it's because they want your opinion, particularly if your opinion is good, to help build buzz for the book. It's not about saying, hey, do you think I should have written this differently? Because I'm going to if you say so. Like that's not how it works. I don't know. With that, I'm done talking about this.
Oh, no. This has been really, really fascinating. And it's just, I don't know. I feel like it's somehow setting things up that there will be some parallel YA field where people are like writing Jordan Peterson themed fanfic.
Jordan Peterson fan fiction.
Yeah. Yes. And I'd like for things to just be, I don't know. I'm like scared of what the backlash will be somehow, because it seems like the ideal isn't fiction that strives to offend. It's just kind of fiction that goes where it goes. And sometimes, who knows what, yeah. But that does though get us to this knitting topic, and specifically to this very strange and very online dynamic of where people who are, for the purposes of the knitting discussion, white people will say that in theory such and such thing could offend people of color, and then people of color coming in to say, actually, this is not offensive. Ignore these white people who are, and I need to find the quote from this, and then I will set up what this knitting story is even about. But there is somebody who, where was this? It was.
Is this a thing about another form of white colonialists? Is that?
Here we go. What I'm looking for is somebody who said, so this is not, so mostly the people weighing in on this are either white people speaking for themselves / the theoretical people of color who could be offended about something. Then there's people who are, and again, this is all an online thread, so I have not background checked who any of these people are, but from the avatars and such, you can guess a bit, you can kind of confirm a bit. Anyway, but there's somebody who's saying, I think, it says, because I was curious, I asked some friends of mine how I felt about folks traveling to India, including women who are actually Indian, not white women doing ally theater on Instagram. And this notion of ally theater I found quite interesting. But is there a cat there by any chance?
There's a cat.
Hello.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah, here he is, making his command appearance.
And hello. So basically the knitting story, which we've been following. So Kat found out about it ages ago, but
somebody sent it to me, somebody who knows me a little too well.
And then there was just like yesterday something about this in Quillette, although I think we have even more to say about it. Although so there's a Quillette piece about it that is, it kind of situates this whole story within the field of knitting, which could be useful if you were interested in the knitting angle. And apparently and it opens with an anecdote from an actual knitting shop in Scotland. So there's a little more sort of knitting background there. But basically what happened, the story that Kat then introduced me to, and I've been really fascinated by, a knitter named Karen Templer wrote, who I guess is it fair to say sort of middle-aged-ish white woman, something like this? American?
Yes, probably. Yeah.
She's not 20 because she's reflecting back on her youth like it was a long time ago. So
right.
Probably, anyway. So she wrote a blog post that was like about knitting, but also about just sort of like reflecting on how timid she'd been in her youth and how afraid to try things and how sort of afraid to like embrace bright colors. Not colors in any sort of racial sense, but like actual like colors, like bright blue or something, like bright colors. And in it, she referred to having been, one of the things she had been sort of afraid of in her youth was travel. And now she's getting over that fear. And when she was young, she recalls that she thought that going to India was as improbable as going to Mars. But now she, as an adult, is going to go to India on vacation and to do something to do with knitting, maybe sort of professional too. So people, and this is some like knitting blog that I guess is just not generally about anything particularly contentious. But then, so the first bunch of comments were all people kind of saying, oh, that's great. Good for you. You're facing your fears and having adventures now. And then comes Alex, right? So mostly this is women, both, I guess, probably among the knitting bloggers and the commenters. But then Alex, who seems to be a man. Again, these are all avatars. I have not researched all of these people, but that would be my guess. There is saying, okay, Alex's first comment, Karen, I ask you to reread what you wrote and think about how your words feed into a colonial imperialist mindset toward India and other non-Western countries. Multiple times you compare the idea of going to India with the idea of going to another planet. How do you think a person from India would feel to hear that? So then you have later in the thread women who, such as Rini Ghosh Chakrabarti, who says, I quote, I'm brown and I grew up in India. I teach about racism and sexism and all the isms every day to university students. You, and that's Karen, didn't offend anyone. The people screaming at you are from another form of white colonialists who will clutch their pearls, anything that has to do with race. And then followed by Deepa, who writes, what Rini said, echoed by another brown woman who grew up in India. I have followed Karen for a while and she does not deserve this. So there's this weird conversation going on between Alex and then there's others who are like Lauren saying, I'm a white cisgender woman and have from much of my life not had to think deeply about issues of race as a result of this privilege, who has said she has started to research these issues. Then there's another person. It's basically just, I'm not going to read all the comments, even though they're each one of them kind of more amazing than the next, but there's just this strange I mean, know that I spent an evening doing this. Kat knows that I did that, but
it was impossible to look away.
It really was. And I guess what was so fascinating about this was it seemed like there was a lot of theoretical offense taking place, but by and large, the people who were actually, like, nobody was actually offended, it seemed. It seemed like there was just, this could have offended somebody, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And then the posts, then Karen, comes in and she apologizes, and she did an apology post. So Kat, what do you make of all of this?
Oh gosh. I mean, I don't know. I have a lot of thoughts about it. And the one that's just kind of coming to mind immediately is what gets lost when this is sort of the, hey, sorry, stop it. No, sorry. There's like, he's playing with the headphones. Okay, you're getting off. You go away. Sorry. To return to the topic at hand, what happens when this becomes sort of the dominant form of conversation in one of these communities? And so often it's female, communities where women go to hang out, to de-stress, like to take a break from having to do work and like manage people's feelings and so on. Like, knitting. It's like, they're just there to connect with a community of like-minded people who share this interest, and it's one of these things that can happen really irrespective of your politics. But once this kind of form of discourse pushes its way in, and I think you and I have both had the experience of seeing a group overtaken by this kind of thing.
Yes, I will discuss in abstract terms.
Yeah.
In a moment. Yes.
That it really just kind of infects the whole thing, and suddenly, like, it's the only form of discourse taking place, and anybody who doesn't want to take part in it just leaves or falls silent. And I think there's a loss there. It just seems sad to me.
I agree. I absolutely agree. And I think sometimes there's even kind of practical repercussions. So I've seen this happening. So this isn't going to give away which one, because I've signed up for and lurking in so many. But in one of the mom forums online that I was sitting here in freezing Toronto, where I can't actually go outside and have a newborn baby, one of the mom forums that I lurk in it's like a mom forum online, has like nearly 20,000 or 15,000 or something members. But it feels like there's 10 people interacting on it just to basically discuss have these conversations that are basically like emotional labor. This could have offended somebody else. This could have theoretically been, like this trigger warning, all these different possible isms. And it's like, it's all that. And it's just, you just know that, like, nearly the full number of like 15,000 women there are just not, including, of course, many who are of marginalized identities of all kinds, are opting out because it's not what anybody except for these like 10 people signed up for. You know what I mean? Like there could be this kind of practical sort of camaraderie, passing along of information, but then once it becomes these sort of things, often where somebody will have made a dramatic exit from the group, they'll post like, I'm posting this and then I'm leaving. And it's like, and they're not actually sort of like, they're not discussions of sort of contentious political issues in a way that could be kind of interesting. It's just like everybody seems to be walking on eggshells, and it's just it's different from the knitting forum in that there's no Alex strolling in, or Joey, who I'm assuming is a man for various reasons, another commenter on the knitting blog. There aren't men coming in to sort of stir things up. But yeah. I just find like Kat, what you're saying exactly, that I think the people who could otherwise be getting something out of it just leave, or just opt out. When it happens.
It's funny, I was thinking about, this is a little convoluted, but at this site Spark Life that I used to write for, For a while, there was a contingent of homeschooled kids who were kind of dominant commenters on the site, and I think, probably goes hand in hand. They were also very, very devout evangelical Christians. And at one point, the site's editors decided to implement this user-submitted post system, kind of similar to BuzzFeed. And it was like, write your own posts, and like they would live on this special part of the site, but if they got enough upvotes, they would kick over to the front page of the main blog. And as soon as this initiative was announced, pretty much immediately, all of the very religious kids started writing all of these very religious posts and then brigaded together to upvote each other. And within a week, you would go to the main site and it was like, welcome to the Spark Life Christian Fellowship. And the editors were like, okay, so this was an experiment and we're not going to do it anymore, because the thing was that it was just an interesting object lesson, though, in how quickly a dedicated minority can take advantage of the fact that people don't want to be rude to them. Nobody wants to say, hey, please stop doing this, like this isn't the place. That they can basically kind of take over the discussion, or take over a space. And when it's like social justice, which is a cause that many of us are sympathetic to, and particularly many women are sympathetic to, or expected to be sympathetic to, it's basically impossible to push back against it.
Absolutely. I think that's interesting what you're saying, especially about I'm sort of catching the like expected to be sympathetic to. I think that's there is this notion that women just don't have the option to just be sort of callous in a certain way that men do about anything. That kind of, yeah. I mean, now I'm going to stray to a totally different topic, far from the outline I had been thinking of here. But there was just an article in, I think, was it Harper's Bazaar, some women's magazine. We're not going to delve into it, but that was about sort of like that people should be more transparent if they have family money. And it seemed like it was so clearly only a conversation that women would have, and it just doesn't seem like something men who have this are worried about. It seems like they're just going with it. I don't know. I think there is something where women are just expected to be kind of more sensitive, and whether or not women actually are, then there can just be this bullying over who's the most sensitive, which suggests that maybe women aren't naturally so.
Right. Well, there's definitely this kind of like socially aggressive dynamic that can take over. I always find myself wondering, like, do male-dominated internet forums spill over into this kind of, infighting? Is somebody on like a fantasy football forum being like, excuse me, Kevin, but your post was really problematic?
I really hope so. I hope no, I don't hope so, but if it happens, please contact Feminine Chaos.
Yeah, I know we have a very male viewership, so
we want to know. We want to know about that.
Guys, please weigh in.
The other, oh boy, so this thing with the other, I guess we should try to probably cover this pretty quickly, but just that it reminded me, this story, like just this, there seems to be this issue where, like, if we just sort of jump back to why this knitting thing was supposed to have been offensive to begin with, let's just look at that for a moment. This question of India as Mars, this could be offensive, this notion, but in what sense? Who is offended in what sense? Well, I guess the way I see it is, I guess part of the problem is I agree with the commenters, including some Indian women who did not find it offensive, but I guess the idea is that it's like this sort of exoticization. Mm-hmm. And I guess what I think is sort of frustrating in this case and in a couple others that we'll just maybe briefly discuss is, rather than saying such and such article is evidence of a culture in which there are certain systemic forms of racism, certain sort of tropes that are problematic, it becomes, this person should be canceled. This person has done wrong. And it seems like there isn't somehow the like conceptual space to say this is evidence of certain systems or certain patterns. You know what I mean? So I guess like this came up with this Eater article about Yelp that was called, sorry, I need to find, oh boy, my computer's being funny, but it was something where it was about the white supremacy of Yelp reviews. It was when it was basically like it was an interesting article about how the concept of authenticity is used or not used for different cuisines. But to discuss this, and this isn't just in the headline, it was in the text as well, about sort of like white supremacy seemed to kind of ignore that plenty of Yelp reviewers are not white. And it just seemed to be kind of, there couldn't just be a discussion of what was actually potentially, evidence. It like, I don't know, it just seemed to have to be like that somebody did something wrong. And then there was also, maybe this will be easier to explain, this Jezebel post about prairie dresses.
Oh God.
Yeah. Where, which is this trend that it's not actually such a new trend at this point, but where the author of that post ignored or sort of just put in parentheses the fact that some of the really popular ones are actually inspired by, and they're by an observant Jewish designer, and they're
I'm just going to break in here really quick in case anybody doesn't know what a prairie dress is.
Oh, thank you. That's a good point. I'm not even 100% sure, so go for it.
They are these, inspired by kind of frontier, like Victorian fashion in the American West. So think like high necks, ruffles. You would have worn a corset under them back at the time.
Right.
Now they're like this very feminine, but also very buttoned up kind of a look.
Absolutely. And we forgot to wear ours. Unless that is a prairie dress. I can't quite see.
I don't have one yet. I'm still looking for one. My mom is a costumer for high school theater, so she has like a serious closet. So I'm reading that the next time I'm back.
You have a good lead there. Yeah, I don't know. This article was just was saying that sort of like, rather than saying that sometimes sort of nostalgic fashions have problematic whatever about them, which I think part of this bothered me because I feel like a heritage chic was a thing that happened like 10 years ago, and that would have been maybe the moment to discuss this, and I would discuss this then, but it's whatever. But for some reason, this was prairie dresses specifically. But it also just seemed like, where was this leaving the reader sort of like, well, what could be worn and not be offensive? And even if you sort of suspend disbelief and pretend that it's only white women wearing these dresses, which doesn't make any sense.
Not historically either.
Right. That is also really, yes. Yeah. Even then you get to this question. Somebody pointed this out in the Jezebel comments as well. Like, if you wear something else that's not a prairie dress, maybe it's going to be cultural appropriation. If you wear a prairie dress and that's offensive because it's historic, because from a different time. And of course, every time that isn't our time was worse in this understanding. I don't know.
It's just about the idea that you can't wear something that is either from another era or modeled after something from another era without also like wearing all of the cultural and historical baggage that comes with it. And that's just not, it's just not reasonable.
It doesn't, no.
It's not as though contemporary fast fashion is free of ethical baggage in and of itself. It was probably made in a sweatshop.
Oh boy, exactly. Everything, all clothing has some sort of problem. Like, I was just reading some article about why it's bad to wear Lululemon because the founder sounds like not a very nice person. And I was thinking, on the one hand, perhaps that's the case. On the other, I don't know what the founder of any clothing company is like as a person. Maybe they're all horrible. How am I deciding what clothing to buy on the basis of which one is how horrible? There's so many things to keep in mind in this regard. And I don't know. I guess I just thought that what was interesting in sort of tying all these things together was just this notion of rather than saying that whether it's prairie dresses or referring to India as exotic or referring to a Mexican restaurant as authentic but not a French one or something like this, it just seems like in all of these cases there's the kind of like team anti-PC, like, nuh-uh, none of this is offensive actually, you know. But then there's also like, there's some approach where you can say like, yes, it's clear what people could find offensive, it's clear what this is hinting at, but like, let's discuss it rather than cancel everybody who has worn X, or, you know what I mean? Like, it just seems...
And maybe there should be a line like, you know, Knitting Karen writing on her knitting blog about how she's excited to go on vacation to India. Like, maybe leave Karen alone. It's just, I mean, there's something here also about how online just incentivizes this incredibly antisocial behavior where, you know, if Knitting Karen were in a public place talking about this, if you overheard her talking about it in a cafe, if you approached her and told her that she was a colonialist and needed to cancel her vacation, which several people did, you know, don't make Indian people deal with...
Oh, that was amazing. Like she's going to really change her vacation. Well, I guess if somebody will change their plans to publish a book,
you know, who knows? But like, this is the thing. If this happened in real life and, you know, you kind of took a snapshot and said, who's the asshole here? Everyone would think that the person telling the woman, you know, intruding upon her to tell her that she's, you know, a systemic racist and needs to cancel her vacation. Like, everyone would think that person was the asshole.
But I think that's also really getting at what the issue is here. It seems like impossible to talk about something being systemic without picking the person to kind of be at the center of a pylon, and the person who gets picked isn't the person who's been overtly racist, but the person who, and we're not going to go into all of the, oh boy, there's so many stories we could discuss that we won't, but somebody who has just been kind of decided to symbolize this based on something kind of shaky.
Yeah, I mean, I think that maybe a good line, and even then it may still be hard to draw, but is to consider whether any harm is in fact done if you just leave this person alone. You know, if Karen goes to India and thinks exotifying thoughts about the people she encounters there, is she...
Or imagines that she would have as a child. That was part of...
Yeah, that was the other thing. It was like, you know, wow, when I was a kid, you know, going to India would have been like, you know, going to another planet. She doesn't hurt anybody if you just let her take her vacation and let her be excited about her vacation.
Exactly. It's fine. She can go on vacation and buy some yarn or...
Yeah. Support local artisans. You know,
it sounds like one of the commenters was saying, you better, like, you should be supporting, you know, like, creatives of color. And she sort of responded like, well, actually, I do that already, but thank you for telling me. And
yeah.
Oh,
the subtext there is always, you should be supporting these, like, knitting Instagrammers who are getting thousands of followers off of this controversy. And, you know,
there's so many Instagram subcultures, and this is one I remain not coordinated or artistic enough to...
Right. We are not staying in our lane with this one.
No, we have completely left our lane to discuss knitting. So I think we've been talking for a while. I don't know for how many more. Well, I guess we could do maybe the brief denunciations. We're gonna, rather than endorsements.
We're gonna denounce them. What are we gonna denounce? I've forgotten. Is it on the outline?
One of them. I think there.
Oh yes.
We have some. Well, there's one that it might just be me denouncing it. There's one that we're both denouncing. We'll find out. So the one we're both denouncing, Kat.
Okay. Anyone who goes on Twitter and finds somebody who's being piled on and announces that they're just here for the ratio.
Do not be here for the ratio.
Yeah, no,
I have nothing. If you, okay, no, in order to not further the pile on, you may be a good person and delightful, but that activity is bad.
Yeah. It corrupts your soul. I mean, it's
the act of being here for the ratio. No, don't be here for the ratio.
Yeah.
And because if you have nothing interesting enough to say about why you're even upset at the initial, or why you're even participating in this, then you have not actually added to the ratio. You're just adding to these numbers, but you're cheating.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I think, I think it's basically just an announcement like, I have no dog in this fight. I just enjoy watching someone suffer.
But you don't see, I think they do have a dog in the fight, because I think if nobody would say, I'm just here for the ratio, if it's somebody who's politically aligned with them. I mean, would they? Like, if somebody...
I'd like to meet somebody in real life who is a here for the ratio person, so I could like ask them about
Yeah,
this.
so that's another call. Get in touch with Kat if you are here for the ratio, because
Yeah, I want to talk to you. But no, I mean, my opinion, just my opinion, is that if you find yourself about to type the words "I'm just here for the ratio," you should sit on your hands and think about your choices.
I'm not going to disagree with you there. I think unless it's sort of sarcastic, or even then, because then you're still, I don't even know. I'm trying to think of a context when it's just...
Maybe stop defending here for the ratio.
No, I'm trying to think if there's any sort of context where I wouldn't agree with that, and I can't really come up with one. So the hand sitting approach seems fine. We're agreed. So this one, maybe we disagree. I don't know. But so this gets back to, we're not going to redo the discussion of this, since Kat, you already discussed this on Feminine Chaos, but the Ian Harper's, yes, with Hillary Kelly, right?
Yeah.
And that was great. So it's really not much to say still about the P Cup guy. So it's Ian Parker's New Yorker article about Dan Mallory. Yes. Publishing guy, best-selling author, possible leaver of P Cups in office.
For more on that, refer to the most recent episode of Feminine Chaos. But more important,
footnote, previous episode of Feminine Chaos. One of the details in this story was that he kind of got his start fictionalizing his life and inventing all sorts of dead relatives and so forth, fictionally killing off a bunch of different relatives and creating all sorts of lies basically about diseases that he and family members had and so forth, was in his college admissions packages.
That's kind of where it all started, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was some interview, I think, with the person who had read one of the applications and just couldn't believe that somebody had lied on that. And this is something I've been obsessed with college admissions essays for a while as kind of a concept, because it is remarkable how they're not fact-checked, and also just what's being, I mean, maybe somewhere they're fact-checked, but it seems that they're at least insufficiently fact-checked. And it's also just, I guess, this notion that the writing sample sent to a college would be the same thing as the extenuating circumstances statement, that these things are wrapped up with each other. So what you're being looked at for it's not like that you had to overcome X obstacle, which could be a useful thing for a university or college to know about. But it's also how you present it, and that it has to kind of also show that you write well, and also kind of present you in a nice light. So it's kind of like memoir. I don't know. But my denunciation is get rid of these essays. Have a writing sample that's unrelated if the school has the resources to assess writing samples, which not all will. But this, and have an extenuating circumstances statement where that's not assessed. I mean, obviously it has to be well enough written that it makes sense. It can't be like a word generally, but this notion that you have to artfully, the emotional labor of having to, but I'm not even kidding. Like, I think it is in this case. I think that seems right, that you have to perform suffering, including at times apparently fictional suffering, to get into college. And just a side note, you don't actually have to do this. I wrote the essay that got me into the college I ended up going to was about llamas and was plainly fiction, like overtly fictional. So you don't have to do this. But yeah, so I say get rid of the college admissions essays.
I have no particular opinion on college admissions essays, so I'm happy to just say, yeah, let's get rid of them. Seems like a low-stakes thing to denounce.
I mean, it's not quite as bad as the ratio here for the ratioism, but it's Although in some ways, I don't know, I think it does set up a culture, though, of this notion of, it's not a culture where victims are rewarded. It's a culture where people who present real or sometimes fake victimhood can kind of get an edge from it, but it's not actually the people who suffered the most, or even who are the most marginalized who win. It's the people who kind of shape a narrative. Anyway,
that's a good way of putting it, and it ties into the whole idea of maybe it's not just online, maybe it's actually across the board incentivizing this kind of antisocial behavior, being manipulative or kind of seeking to present yourself as oppressed for purposes of self-advancement.
Yes, which, oh boy, we could go many more hours on the topics that could lead to. But I think we should probably...
Let's call it here.
Yeah, we'll wrap up here.
We'll save some for next time.
For sure. So thank you, Kat, and thank you, viewers, for tuning in to some more Feminine Chaos.
It's been fun.
Bye.